Molly Maurice, welcome to the show.
There you go.
Hi.
Look, Molly, you're clearly hyper intelligent. You went to Oxford University. You've done a lot of stuff whilst there. You were the treasurer of TEDx. You were on the water polo team. You were the captain of the women's rowing team. You then graduated. You then got fired, and then you went into business. What did you expect to be doing when you graduated from Oxford Uni?
Not getting sacked. That was definitely something I wasn't expecting. I feel like my career history is a bit like Henry VIII's wives, like divorced, beheaded, survived. I'm like redundant, sacked, redundant, left voluntarily. Yeah, I think that, classic sort of adolescent overachiever. I thought that I had to do everything and get to Oxford and pick up every single society and everything. Quickly realised in my kind of mid-20s that was not necessarily the right way forward, but I definitely expected to have a successful career in investment banking and have made a lot of money by now, and that hasn't happened.
And that hadn't happened because I know we'll go on to the reason for the business later, but I suppose the reason that you got fired initially, as far as I could tell, was because you asked for, ironically, flexibility in your job. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. So I've had an autoimmune disease since I was 18, which means that sometimes I can't walk. It used to be quite frequent back then, probably about once a week. Thankfully now, due to Flexor working your own hours, it's probably only about twice a year. So I'm much, much healthier now than I was. But I kind of struggled through for about 18 months in equity research, and it's actually the second investment bank, 'cause the first one, they cut the equities division. I was made redundant, got hired somewhere else. And then they sacked me because I put in a request to work from home one day a week to stop taking sick days.
Wow.
Because I was still able to use my brain and work.
Obviously.
And they sent me to an occupational health therapist who said to me, I'm just going to classify you as disabled here to avoid any discrimination, because he said he knew what often happened.
Yeah.
And 10 days later, they called me into a room and sacked me. And thank God he did classify me as disabled, because they wouldn't have had to pay me off if that wasn't the case.
Oh, good. So you did sort of take them as far as you could and get what you could out of them.
Yeah, of course. They paid for my silence, though. I can't name them.
No exclusives on this just yet. But look, Maurice, looking at you, you were obviously brought up in Dublin. You went to the University of Dublin, actually, to study business and law. Again, something that has worked quite well, seeing as you're now in business. But before that, you're in the betting world, am I right?
Yeah. I worked for Betfair for about 6 years. Actually, going way back, I wanted to be a vet, even though I grew up in Dublin, which is like unheard of. It's generally like a more of a countryside activity in Ireland. Tried to be a vet for about 3 months. You realise it's absolutely knock it out for and completely useless, and retrained to do business and law, and then became an accountant for my sins, which is about as exciting as it sounds.
That is quite boring.
And then worked in betting. Yeah, so I worked in Betfair for forever.
So it must have helped, though. Come on, the fact that you're now running a business with Molly, you must be able to pick up, I'm assuming, the books, look at the legal aspect of it. Did that help you in forming Flexor?
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I mean, the main reason we set up Flexa was to stop Molly getting fired all the time. Like,
Yeah, I wasn't
so
allowed to work for other people anymore.
How did you guys meet?
we really didn't want another as a couple.
Yeah, we met on Hinge.
You're
in
joking, did you? Amazing.
End of 2017. Yeah, we've been a couple now for 4 and a bit years.
Wow.
Well, we met on a dating app.
There you go. We had some Voice of a Dating App Thursday on here a while ago. Sadly, you didn't meet on Thursday, but you did meet on Hinge, which is interesting. Now, how does it work? How does it work in terms of working with your other half? Do you find that stressful? Do you find that positive?
We answer this separately, will we? In case
I think
Should
so.
I leave
think
and you
so.
give your answer?
I personally find it fine, but I'm interested to hear how you find it. Cool.
I think it's a good thing. We found it's very interesting when we've been raising investment. A lot of investors are very biased against couple founders.
Yeah.
They tend to kind of project their own relationships onto you and think, well, I could never start a business with my partner, or we'd be no good at that. We wouldn't possibly want to bring our personal lives into our professional lives. And so they assume that you're the same. Which has often meant then they're like, no, we're not comfortable investing, you're more likely to break up. Whereas actually I think it's kind of the opposite.
Right,
like we've had a history in our relationship of dealing with conflict, as any relationship has. It's not that we argue a lot. It's any relationship, you're used to resolving issues, and then when that comes into starting a business, obviously you're constantly overcoming hurdles. And I think if you started a company with somebody that you don't know as well. Whether, there are loads of founders that never really met properly. They just became founders together. They're far less well set up to be able to deal with conflict and overcoming obstacles and keeping going, I think, than a couple is. It does mean we never switch off, ever. So we'll be at the pub. Oh, Flexor. We'll be at dinner. Oh, we could do this, Flexor. Constant. Wake up in the morning. Oh, the Slack, Flexor, great. It never ends. But I that's a good thing from a business perspective, bad thing from a personal perspective.
I can imagine, but it's funny you mentioned the pub.
I think that we've done a lot.
It is funny you mentioned the pub, because isn't that, Molly, where you founded, or at least started, the business? Now, I'm assuming if we just had to look at when you started the business, was this after a Hinge date? You were in Hackney pub, you came up with the idea for Flexor? Or was there more to it than that?
Move very fast.
Move very fast, like date 5.
Yeah,
We should
date
start a
5.
business together more than anything else, actually.
That was the dog, I think, actually came in about date 5.
So how did you come up with the idea then, apart from the fact that you didn't want to get fired, you couldn't work for anybody?
Yeah.
Yeah. Aside from that, you tell us better than I do. You go for it, Mel. Chime in.
So it was Maurice's idea, not mine. And we were chatting about how rubbish job hunting is. Maurice was thinking about leaving Betfair.
Yeah.
Wanted to maintain the same level of flexibility that you had. I was thankfully working at a flexible company and hadn't been sacked yet. So I was also...
Time was ticking.
Definitely.
It was coming, but not yet.
No, that one I left voluntarily. But we were chatting about how rubbish it is to actually find the companies that offer flexibility. Maurice said, well, surely that's quite an easy thing to build, where we just bring together the people that want flexibility and the companies that offer it, and we verify them somehow. And I was like, yeah, I guess. But like I never thought of myself starting a business, and I don't think you did really either.
No, and
But then I think over a couple of weeks, it's kind of ticking in the back of our minds, and then you were thinking about leaving anyway, without necessarily anything lined up.
yeah.
So I bought a whiteboard off Amazon and gave it to you.
Yeah, the whiteboard is still here.
Wow, what a gift that
sitting
is.
over there. I know. That was the moment of reality. It was like, actually, we'll do this properly. It was like, here's an enormous whiteboard, and I bought this. So if you don't do something, I've wasted my time getting you the whiteboard, and that was it. And then we went to the pub and started like literally sketching like what this thing would look like.
So
and early
hold
on, we were more
let's
like,
stop with that. So you took the
jobs
whiteboard.
board.
You took the whiteboard to the pub, and you
No.
Down to the Chesham Arms, enormous whiteboard, a smaller pad.
We took an A3 pad of paper and some felt tips.
better makes sense. That does make sense. So you came up with this idea. You had to
That was
bootstrap it to a certain extent, but you guys couldn't make a website. So you pumped a guy called Tim in, who was the third co-founder of Flexa. He was the one that built the website. So you guys didn't have the ability to do that.
Yes.
But you gifted him shares. It's quite risky for someone just to gift shares to another founder. What was the reason for that?
Yeah, we were in a kind of funny position where like we were willing to put some cash in to get stuff off the ground, but not like absolutely go hard at it. So the only realistic way to get like a really, really good technical co-founder, good CTO was to give him some equity. And we were pretty lucky with Tim in that like we just met him off AngelList.
Not Hinge.
Not Hinge. Not Hinge.
What's AngelList?
Met him off AngelList, went for a coffee.
I've not heard AngelList before, so explain
that
to me what
again?
that is. What AngelList is.
It's like a startup community, I suppose. It's kind of like where investors and startups and people looking to work in startups and all of that sort of comes together. It's like a really mixed use platform of investment opportunities. It's like a job board. It's where people will go to look for co-founders. It's kind of a hodgepodge of startup stuff. Yeah. And I met him for coffee, and within about 2 minutes I was like, oh, if we get this guy, he's going to be really good. We're going to have to twist his arm because we were so early stage. Yeah.
And then luckily he said, yeah, cool. And he came on board.
And we'd met some proper spoofers before that as well.
Such spoofers. Unbelievable spoofers.
But you believed in this guy.
Like
Tim,
people who couldn't
so
write a line of
much.
code.
You believed in him so much you gave him some shares. How many shares did you give him? What was the kind of value of the business at the time, and how did you work out? And I suppose, Maurice, this is probably your line of interest. How did you find out how much the business was able to gift him? Did you value it based on your accountancy expertise? Did you
Yeah.
just go, here's some equity, let's do something?
Yeah. At that point, we basically said, here's 15% of bugger all, but
It's like about a
eventually,
pound, I think.
but eventually it might be worth something if we all stick at it.
Okay.
And I think like anything, like it's how much is a piece, like how long is a piece of string, or how much
Yeah.
is the piece of string worth? You're like, well, 15% seems about fair, but you want someone to be actually encouraged. You don't want to like lowball them. It's kind of pointless. So you kind of came to that amount, and then at that stage, like the business was just a concept. It was a slide deck, so it wasn't that meaningful. But
Yeah.
I think there was enough there to capture his interest.
I think when you start a business that when you have a co-founder come in that early on, like equity has to be pretty significant because it's a big punt. Like deciding to spend a lot of time, even though you were contracting, I was still working part time. Tim was working because he'd actually exited a previous startup that he sold to Oliver Wyman, and he was still working. So to get him to dedicate his spare time to it, like you have to be a proper co-founder. When you see these jobs advertised on LinkedIn where it's like co-founder and the business has been going for like 2 years and they're offering someone about 2%, like you're not really a co-founder at that point, you're just senior leadership.
Yeah, exactly.
So, I mean, so when Tim came on board, then I'm assuming it was pre any revenue, or did you have some kind of transaction going through the business at that point?
Well, we didn't even have a website.
Did he have a website? Let alone revenue. There was
literally like
nothing.
giving
There
him
was
a piece
me
of
and Molly and I in the pub.
Wow, I mean, he'd take some balls for Tim to just go, yeah, not a problem at all. Did he have money to be able to keep himself going in the background then if you guys weren't paying him at all? He just clearly believed in both of you.
Yeah, so he, as Molly mentioned, he had exited a previous business and he was on his earn out at the acquirer of that business. So he did that as his full-time job, but he knew he was kind of moving out of there. So that was kind of his backup. But we took his spare time.
Yeah, we didn't, like any startup, it takes a while to be able to pay yourselves and other people. So you kind of have to do something in the background to keep yourself going.
But in 2020, and correct me if I'm wrong, it was around October, but you guys went and essentially got a pre-seed fund of £250,000, roughly. Now, I'm assuming that was what kind of has taken you to where we are today, am I right in saying? Or have you sort of already burnt that up and are looking at the next tranche?
We've done 2 rounds and we're doing a third currently. So we've raised about 770,000 to date.
Yep.
And we're doing a 2 million round at the moment, which is actually mostly full, thankfully. And that 770 has kind of got us to where we are today. We haven't used it all up yet.
Thankfully.
So talk to me about the initial pre-seed then and how you went and funded that, because obviously there was the 3 co-founders at the time. You obviously went, I'm assuming, with some kind of plan that wasn't just on a piece of A4 paper to some investors. Were they crowdfunded? Was it done through VCs? How did you go about raising that?
So I guess from a fundraising perspective, I'll probably answer it because I've sort of led on the face of it, and then Maurice has done all of the actual useful financial modelling and pulling everything together so that we can put some evidence behind our projections. So we went out it took about 4 months to do the pre-seed round. Like it was maybe 5, it was quite slow because we had very early traction. The website was launched. We launched it in February. We had probably about 6,000 users, I think, with very limited spend on that. We'd grown quite fast organically, and about 20 trial companies. So we weren't making any money.
Yeah.
A lot of it's a bright can of worms to open, but there's a real quandary for a lot of early stage startups. Sometimes it can be more detrimental to make revenue in the beginning than it is to keep free. Because once you start making revenue, that becomes the North Star metric. And, you're not always prioritizing it. So we didn't have revenue at that point, or maybe we just tested it, had about 500 quid.
I think we literally had £500 in the P&L.
And that was just through testing, like what may or may not work. We didn't know anybody. We didn't have a network in that sense. We just kind of reached out to people. And we got an introduction to Q Ventures, who is the tiny VC that was the first money in. We got another intro through somebody I used to work with to a kind of super angel. And a couple of other angels came in as well. So that's how we kind of made up the $250,000 round. But it was a real learning curve and a world that we had never explored before. Yeah,
it's a bit of a slog. If you come from the corporate world, I think like we mistakenly thought we'll raise money quite quickly because there's more money in the asset class than there's ever been. And there's loads of like 23-year-old lads somehow raising millions. And I think we kind of came out going, well, we've got, more tangible experience and better CVs than most teams you'll see raising money. I think we thought we'd raise quite quickly, and we just didn't. Like it took way longer than we thought it would, especially the first time round. It took way longer than we thought we did. We got there in the end, but it was a bit of a slog.
And how long did it take you then to raise that £250,000?
4 or 5 months.
4 or 5 months,
Yeah, 4 or 5
But
months.
then closing it was a different matter. Like actually, like once the commitment was in, and then we had to do all the legals and go through everything, which then took about another 6 weeks.
Yeah, and then we did an ASA bridge round at the end of last year, and then again that was a similar length of time from what I remember.
5 months.
5 months, yeah, all in to get that done.
Yeah.
So you did your initial fund, you got your £250,000. It took a little bit longer than you thought. I'm assuming Tim had got the website up to scratch, or at least nearing a level of completion, or was that still very much a work in progress at that point as well?
It's constantly evolving.
Yeah.
It was a working website. It did what we wanted it to do, but we launched as a job platform, which is quite different to what we became. So the website then was a job platform. People invested in a job platform. And then in March of last year, we pivoted to being more like Glassdoor, where it's like a top of funnel hiring platform that verifies companies and gets them discovered by hundreds of thousands of people for being a great place to work. So showcasing the information that's usually not put up front in the hiring process. And then obviously, much to Tim's dismay, the whole website had to be redone.
Well, at least he gets to keep his job and keep busy. In terms of why you guys pivoted to more of a Glassdoor funnel kind of proposition, what was the reasoning for that? Because you guys did so well in funding it during the pandemic. Was there some kind of connotation there and reasoning?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there were like dozens of kind of different reasons that all sort of eventually triggered the pivot. So I think the first one is that the unit economics of a job platform are pretty grim. You can talk a bit more about that because you're in charge of it.
It's just very hard to make job platforms work. You just need so much sort of candidate liquidity, and it just requires millions and millions and millions. And it's not that it's undoable. Like there's people doing it well, like Otta, for instance, but it's very, very hard going. Requires a lot of funding. So the unit economics are not phenomenal, and trying to retain companies when their North Star metric is did we employ someone through your platform can be quite cagey. So that was part of it, definitely.
The second reason was when we were listening to the companies that were signing up with us, they weren't necessarily signing up with us for the reason we thought that they were, which was to post jobs. They were signing up with us because they loved the kind of notoriety of being flexible that Flexor would give them and the employer brand element of it. And so we were like, well, if that's why people are joining us, then we should probably start listening and see if we can adapt this to suit what their needs are better in the problem that they think we're solving better, which then kind of fed into the third reason, which was that the kind of recruitment and the market that we sit in, we don't like saying we're in recruitment, but ultimately kind of de facto we are, it's been really, really uninnovative for like a very long time. It's still done in the same way. There is a job, you apply to it. You don't know what it's like to work there, and it's a horrible process. And it's been like that for decades since the internet facilitated it, basically. And we were thinking, surely it can be done differently. Like, why do these really onerous application processes have to happen? Why does the poor recruitment experience have to be like that? And actually moving up the funnel to being more about recruitment marketing and providing people with the information that they wanted suddenly seemed a lot more innovative, and our kind of acquisition of candidates and companies, once we pivoted to that, it kind of skyrocketed. So it was clearly the right move in terms of solving a problem that we wouldn't have known was there until we'd gone out and built a job platform. It went quite well, but we thought we could do it better.
Yeah, it's funny. Nearly every time I ever show a graph to someone of like almost any metric from Flexa over time, no matter what it is, there's this little line, and it goes, and I always have this little thing that goes, pivot here, pivot was here. And it's just like that kind of changed everything. But yeah, probably the best decision we ever made.
So many businesses, though, pivoted during the pandemic. Some worked, some didn't work. Your pivot evidently has worked. Now, at what point over the last sort of 24 months have you guys started to see significant growth in the revenue? Was it literally aligned to that pivot, or was that just the profitability aspect?
I'd say probably down the lines of the pivot, from what I remember. It kind of had two upsides. It saved us money and made us more revenue. You'll know better than me, Molly, but I think it's a clearer sales proposition from the B2B side for us when we talk about what we are. Like, we're at the top of the hiring funnel. It's a Glassdoor competitor piece rather than down here with the kind of Indeeds and LinkedIns of this world. I think that's clearer for companies. So from a revenue perspective, things really started to kick off really from that time, which I guess was around April or May of 21. That's when revenue started to take off for us, I think.
Yeah, but we were still kind of testing pricing and testing what worked until September, October of last year.
Yeah.
So I think kind of it's been in the last few months that it's been much easier to project what our revenue will become because pricing is consolidated. Like we know what we're doing now.
That's helpful knowing what you're doing. But when you kind of went into it, do you think that element of naivety was useful in coming up with a kind of innovative product? Because so many people will have looked at it and gone, yeah, it just might not work for the reasons you've kind of alluded to already, Maurice. But do you think that now, in hindsight, that was a benefit?
I think so, yeah.
Definitely.
I think if we hadn't gone down the initial route, we never would have got to where we are now. Like, I certainly would not have conceived ever of what Flex has become when we first started talking about it. It just, I couldn't have conceived of it unless we'd gone down this sort of job board route and learned what people actually wanted on both sides of the marketplace.
Yeah.
I think we would have ended up with a totally different product.
I agree, and like we always, it's such a wanky term, but the term like category creation, in a sense, is kind of where we've got to. But you can't really create a category without having known what it was before, but also have been removed enough from it to be able to, reshape it and think of how it can be better.
Yeah, I think there was upside in that none of the three of us ever worked in HR tech or recruitment or anything else. We just came at it from a totally different stance and totally different starting point.
Well, I was going to say that neither of you had any experience in this world whatsoever. And, how did you actually fund yourselves in terms of living? Because it's not as if, I'm assuming, you had any savings at that point, or did you? I might be wrong.
I didn't.
I wasn't sure how to answer that. I was like, well, I'm not going to answer for Molly here.
There we go. Too much.
I was
drinking
in a
in
pretty
the pub.
fortunate position. I had a reasonably senior job at Betfair and had been on like a few equity schemes there and stuff that had gone really well. So I was in a reasonably good position.
You were still contracting though.
I was still doing a bit of contracting though. Yeah, I did some contracting for a corporate education firm when we first launched.
Yeah.
Flexa for the first few months. So yeah, still did a little bit, but we were thankfully okay. But I think it obviously is a barrier for people if they want to give it a go. It's like, well, I have to keep working because I don't have the money. Like clearly, how will I do that?
I was working 4 days a week, and then doing Flexor on weekends and Fridays, and then took the leap to go full time on Flexor, and then took up a bit of contracting on the side again, but I got sacked.
Honestly, what is it? I genuinely, I knew you got sacked once, but why so many times? What do you do? What
did I do? I do think.
Sorry, Castle Avenue actually is so funny.
It is really funny. And what's also funny is like you'll ask my old boss at the company that I left voluntarily, and he thinks I was great, and he doesn't understand why I was sacked so many times. We still go for drinks.
I can vouch for that. I've met him recently, and he did say that.
Yeah.
That is true.
So it's not that I'm a terrible employee. I don't necessarily hold my opinions back sometimes, and so if I think someone's doing a terrible job, then I will tell them.
Especially if you tell your
I'd
manager
say
that, then I can see why you would be sacked, seeing as they're the ones that sack you.
Yeah. I just don't think I think ultimately it was much better that I started Flexor and working for ourselves than it is that I continued to try and work for other people.
I'd say you would be a challenging person to manage. My summary. You need a certain type of personality to manage you, I think.
How do you manage your team, though? Looking at, obviously, Molly, you've had years of experience of, I suppose, going in and out of jobs. You've got great kind of oversight of multiple different industries. Maurice, obviously, you were working for Betfair. I'm sure you had teams underneath you of good size, actually, seeing as you were so senior. Does that help in terms of growing a startup team and managing people correctly based on that kind of cross-section of experience?
Yeah.
I think it definitely does. Yeah. I think one of the biggest challenges for people starting a business, especially earlier in their careers, is that they haven't managed a whole lot of people. Like, I think it's probably the most challenging thing to do.
Yeah.
I'd probably, like, of all the stuff I ever did, the most useful was managing a big team of people. Like, that's the most useful thing. It helps you both hire the best people and, keep them entertained and make sure they're active in the job. So yeah, I think it's made a big difference. And then you getting fired everywhere probably helped.
I learned what not to do.
Exactly. There you go.
When you're managing people.
Every cloud has a silver lining.
Which is really useful, yeah. Yeah. But I also, like, from a management perspective, I knew how I hated to be managed. And I do think that, you try and adapt yourself to the people that you're managing. I also think I think emotional intelligence is a really, really underrated skill in founders as well. And I think that does actually make very good managers. And thankfully, I would like to say we're quite emotionally intelligent people. Other people might say differently, but I think it is a skill that really, really helps with hiring and managing, and especially managing a remote team as well.
Yeah, I was just thinking that, like, we think that, but maybe if you asked the team, they'd be like,
They
no,
might
they're
not.
arseholes. Like, they can't stand them.
Well, that's interesting that your team's actually so remote. I mean, in terms of how you have coped with managing a remote workforce, because that must have been quite difficult to start a business, hire new staff that essentially you've never really met before, and then build a business, build a brand off the back of essentially Zoom meetings, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It was a bit mad. We did all of our hiring through Flexor as well, which was quite cool. I think because it was through COVID and we didn't really have another choice, we now, look back on it and it wasn't too difficult, just because we had to do it that way. I think the way that what we've kind of looked for in early hires is for them to be very strong generalists and to be able to pick up lots of different things. I think in startups, it's a really, really important and underrated skill for the people that work for you, is to make sure that they're able to pick up lots of different things. And ultimately, we also just hired on making sure that we got on with people and that they also shared an enthusiasm for what Flexor was trying to build, because I think in the early days, they have to buy into your vision, because it's not always easy working for a startup. I don't think that was necessarily a secret sauce to hiring.
In terms of having 3 co-founders, that is a luxury, right? Because so many people go into business on their own and they wish they had just a co-founder, a singular co-founder. But you guys obviously having Tim as well must be a real benefit to be able to thrash out ideas. Has that been quite powerful, more so than you might have thought?
Definitely. It's so good. I literally couldn't run Flexa by myself. You might be able to. I definitely would be able to. Let alone
There'd be no website.
Tim. Like, there'd be no website. We get nothing done. We just talk about dogs all day long. Like, it'd be rubbish. Having more than one, and even better, more than 2, I think makes a huge difference. And always when I meet people who are trying to do the single founder thing, I'm just like, how are you doing this? Like,
They're always really stressed.
They're
as
so
well.
stressed. It's like, find someone else. Like, you can't. I don't think most people can do it by themselves. It's so hard.
It's not just the like burden of work. There's a lot of work, obviously. Like, there's a huge amount to do when you're fundraising, plus the product, plus building it, plus getting your customers on, plus working out what on earth you're actually doing. It's the emotional burden, I think, is huge. If you've got no one else to talk to that really understands it, you feel very, very lonely and isolated. And like, even if I go to the pub, why do I always talk about the pub? If I go to the pub with friends,
Because you're a functional alcoholic, seemingly. Because you mentioned the pub about 12 times since you started.
if I go to the pub with friends and they haven't, they don't live and breathe Flexor like we do, I just don't want to talk about it because there's too much to explain. Whereas if we're together, we can talk about it freely because we understand it.
Yeah.
And if you're a sole founder, I'm sure you feel exactly the same when you try and talk to friends about your business. You just don't want to.
Yeah.
So you bottle it all up inside, and I can't imagine that.
You said emotional burden. It's like emotional torture. Like, it's just such hard going, and to not be able to talk to someone else about it would drive
It'd
me
be horrible.
mad. Yeah, and I'd say I never talk to my friends who aren't your friends. I never talk to them about it. If they say how's Flexa going, I'd be like, yeah, good. Great,
Yeah,
like things are good. Raising
asking
some
me
money.
questions.
Don't ask me anything else. I don't want to talk about it. Whereas you and I could talk about it all day. It's just
Yeah.
funny. But there you go.
And I suppose just looking at, that's again emotional intelligence, because you're aware of how to communicate with mates as well as each other. But in terms of if you don't have a co-founder and you don't have anyone to talk to, how would you cope? I suppose you guys don't know how you'd cope.
I don't know. I think I try and meet other people in the same position. Like, that's like a friendship group for stressed co-founders.
I know
think that's
a
what
few
I do.
other sole founders, like
Ali
a few
and stuff,
that have befriended me on the internet.
So there's a theme here. There's a Hinge,
because-
befriending people on the internet. There's pubs. There's being fired. This is not the podcast I thought it was going to be.
But they've reached out to me as a founder because they want to talk to other founders, and often because we post a lot on LinkedIn and we talk a lot on kind of podcasts and panels and things, and often you will get people reach out to you and say, can I ask some advice? Like, it'd be really nice to speak to somebody who's in the same position, and they're nearly always sole founders that will reach out. So clearly there is a they do, if you're on your own, you'll seek out people who are in a similar position because it's easier to talk to than, say, your friends or your family who aren't in the same position.
So in terms of how Flexor actually operates, looking at it now, you mentioned dogs. I love dogs because on your website you have this little dog icon for I'm assuming employees that enjoy to have dogs in their offices. Now, what criteria do you have in place for the Flexor 100? What allows an employer to class themselves as that?
So we built 2 different indices with like hundreds of thousands of data points from our users that say what their flexible working preferences are, companies that do our quiz to find out how flexible they are, and also employees that we survey. So it's all kind of self-reinforcing to make sure that we understand exactly what the average in the market is. And then we assess companies based on like a 2-stage benchmarking process. Yeah. And it allows us to quantify flexibility, which normally it's very difficult to do. The first stage is a HR leader or senior leader will do its very objective quiz that's based on flexibility on location, flexibility on hours, benefits that add flexibility, like work from anywhere schemes, enhanced annual leave, enhanced parental leave or family leave, those kind of things. And also key cultural indicators. So do senior leadership work flexibly as well? Is flexibility encouraged or is it put up with? Have you ever had to request it? Those kind of things. And a company has to score above 60 to be taken on to the second stage. And then we then survey internally with employees. So about 20 to 50% of a company has to do a very similar survey, but more subjective. Do you feel supported? Can you access everything? So that we know it's truly the case that company is flexible. We're not just taking their word for it.
That's really interesting. I think I'm going to have to go through the process.
And then the top 100 of those are ranked.
Yeah. The top 100 of those are then ranked by the scores in those 2 bits.
There you go.
Fine. And then you get your Flexor 100. I get that. That makes absolute sense. And you alluded earlier, Molly, to Ali, and I'm assuming you mean Ali from Juno, who on your website has a testimonial. The only reason I say that is because he was on the podcast. Now, his is very much around employee well-being and he doesn't like the term benefits, but employee perks, I suppose. Culturally in businesses, the way that organisations are changing over the last 24 months has been enormous, right? They've gone from people being in the office 9 to 5, people not being given benefits or perks, to full flexibility and really, really big incentives and perks. Do you think this is entirely stemmed from the pandemic, or do you just think it's a cultural thing as Generation Z and millennials become more abundant in the world of employment?
I think it's such a complex interweaving of the pandemic accelerating something that people already wanted but didn't know if it was okay to ask for. And I think that the pandemic has normalized flexible working beyond needing a reason to access it. So it used to be that you put in a request and you had to have a reason for that request. Children, for me, an autoimmune disease, but that wasn't good enough. Or, caring responsibilities or whatever. And you had to have that reason, and then that reason was weighed up as to whether it was good enough. But loads of people wanted to work flexibly. They just felt they didn't have that reason. And so because the pandemic removed the need for a reason and just allowed everybody to explore the idea of flexible working for themselves, it then made people realize, actually, this is the way that I want to work and I shouldn't have to justify it. And so then I think that snowballed into a total reframing of the future of work and the idea of choice in your working environment.
I think job mobility has changed everything. The fact that we're no longer candidates are no longer so constrained by where they can work. It just changes everything, because then you can say, well, I don't want that offer because I can work for 10 times, 20 times, 100 times more companies than I could last year. And then the candidate market is totally different to what it was. And if you ask any recruiter, they'll say this is the most candidate-driven market in history. It is what it is.
Yeah,
100%. It's actually fascinating. And just a report that I found online from 100 global workers, 72% of them said that they were exhausted from working in a hybrid way, which is really interesting, because I suppose what they're kind of getting at is that actually they don't know when to switch off when they're working from home because there isn't that specific stop button. Do you find that with your team having it so remote?
It's a good question. I think our team, it all varies, isn't it? Because when I think of our head of sales, who's awesome, Chris, he is done at 4 and that is it. Slack is snoozed. You can't get him on his phone unless it was an emergency. He's finished and that's it. And he just has great boundary setting with it. I think for other people, it just depends on their personalities. Some of them will just keep working because they like to be night owls. I think it really varies person to person. In terms of clients of ours, I don't know if you've seen anything on how they approach it.
Yeah, I think it all comes back to expectation setting. I think that the companies that don't say it's okay to start at 8 and finish at 4, as Chris, for example, does, and aren't as output focused, and they're more about, oh, are you present? Are you available to answer my Slack at 9 p.m.? They're the ones with employees that will struggle with burnout and not being able to switch off. But it's not all on companies. Like, I do think that there is also a level of personal responsibility for knowing whether you're the kind of person like me who's going to check your Slack at 2 a.m. if you wake up. Like, and I therefore turn my phone off because otherwise I'll check it. Like, there is a level of personal responsibility as well as companies.
It's
and
interesting.
It's that clear communication between the two.
It is interesting because I think you're absolutely right. We as a business, we let people, come in from 8 a.m, finish at 4 p.m. Arguably, there's an element there of people overworking. Specifically, Dan Miller, sat to my right, is the producer who's always in late. But that's, personal responsibility. Heard it here first. But in terms of efficiencies, I found it fascinating how 56% of people said they're more productive working in a hybrid way.
Yeah, definitely. I think to steal the concept that an Oxford professor, Carl Benedict Frey, used when I was talking on a panel with him a few weeks back, and he said that in-person and remote work are complementary. And I really agree with that, because the in-person work can be very different to at-home work. You're more likely to want to do very focused tasks with no interruption when you're at home, and you want to do kind of collaborative brainstorming and innovative thinking and relationship building when you're in an office or meeting people. And I think that the fact that you can choose what environment you're going to be in to suit the task that you're going to do that day means that you can tailor your environment to be your most productive.
In terms of self-control, that is, as you rightly allude to, something that so many people haven't yet fully grasped. Molly, looking back, I suppose, at when you were 17, 18, for instance, and you were diagnosed with the autoimmune disease, you had to have an element of self-control, I'm assuming, back then, which I'm assuming has now transpired into you going, actually, turning my phone off is the way I cope with this. Do you think that invisible barrier has helped you cope with other things in your later life?
Yeah, I think I had to get to know myself very quickly when I was probably a bit too young to cope with the fact that I was very, very sick and I didn't really know what was going to happen. And I was going through, it took a decade for me to get diagnosed.
Wow.
So you're going through all of that and you don't really know what's wrong with you. And I think that has helped massively. And it probably meant, and led to me being very headstrong and pushing back, because I knew myself and I knew what I did like and what I didn't like, maybe before a lot of other people would have done, just because I was very sick and I kind of had to deal with that. So I think it has helped a lot in starting Flexor. Probably didn't help in my career, and probably meant that I got sacked a lot.
And took up a mild level of drinking in a local pub. Maurice, in terms of Maurice, how you cope personally and how you dust yourself off when you've been knocked back, I suppose, because over this journey since you started, it can't have all been plain sailing. You can't have just ticked every box and done everything perfectly. Give me an example of when things didn't quite go to plan.
Oh, there's loads and loads. I don't know where to start.
Has anything ever gone to plan?
No. It's such a cliche, the whole startups are a roller coaster, but they actually they are, you're so up and down. And you just kind of get used to the fact that Tuesday sometimes is terrible, but then Wednesday and Thursday are awesome, and Friday's also crap again, and you just kind of get on with it. I'm trying to think some of our worst stuff since we started. I think when we were closing out one of our funding rounds, didn't we have some panic stations at the end where we couldn't get it over the line? Do you remember that?
Oh yeah, we were using DocuSign, and then it didn't actually have the functionality to send to as many people as we needed, and we'd already got half the signatures, but we couldn't get the other half, so we had to switch to a different digital signing provider, go back out to all the investors that we'd already got the signatures from and redo the whole thing.
Get them to sign the whole thing all over again. Quite a few people on a Saturday, some very busy people who were not impressed. We were going through the whole process over and over again. But it just happens. It's like there's probably 3 things a week where it's so annoying, and it's so different to a corporate job because there's some division, whereas it's your thing. You're like, I have to send that letter of engagement and do the legal corrections, or we're not going to get paid. That kind of stuff is very, very frustrating. But you do get used to it.
You do get very used to it. I always say that if you'd have put ourselves 2 years ago into a week's work with our like what we do now, you'd have a breakdown. But it's the slow
You'd be in the pub again.
transition into the kind of stuff that you deal with that makes it bearable.
Yeah,
it's like you don't get plunged in. It's like you're introduced to it slowly.
It's the hot frog and water thing. Although hopefully we won't boil at the end. But like you go up 1 degree each time. The frog doesn't care. But if you put the frog into the hot water, like bam, it's too hot.
Yeah.
That's how it is. I think.
Eventually, though, Maurice, I hate to break it to you, the frog will care. If it's just, but in terms of learning to be an entrepreneur, because so many people that I speak to on these podcasts, they actually had businesses before they went to university. They started something at university, they graduated, they started another business. You guys both seem to have, whether you succeeded or you didn't succeed in your corporate career, and it's different for both of you. Neither of you had businesses up until essentially 2 years ago. I mean, did you and can you learn how to be an entrepreneur?
Yeah, I think you definitely can. One thing you shouldn't try to do when you're learning to be an entrepreneur is think that reading loads of books is going to help you, because it's not. I have a very strong opinion on this.
Go on.
I see so many people be like, "Oh, I read Lean Startup and it changed my life," and it's like, no, it didn't. Go and do something. But it really winds me up. But I think you can learn to be an entrepreneur. But I think the only way that you can learn to be an entrepreneur is by becoming an entrepreneur and learning as you go. I don't think you can take a course or read a book or try to learn the things that you'll need, because you don't know what you'll need. Like one day is so different to the next, and I think that you just have to be very accepting of the fact it's going to be a massive unknown, but also one of the most interesting things and steepest learning curves that you'll ever take.
I would agree with all of that, and I'd add a slightly different point. I think if you're coming from a corporate background, going back to the generalist versus specialist theme, I think if you do a more generous job, it's more of a grounding. So where I worked, it was a hub and spoke model. You sat over a piece of the business, you had to do a bit of everything, or know people who did a bit of everything. That made the entrepreneurial journey a little bit easier. I mean, still very hard, but a little bit easier. Whereas I think if you're in a super specialist job, you're back to kind of Molly's situation. If you just have to learn as you go, if you come from something that was a very specialist background.
Yeah.
In terms of scaling the business then overseas, because looking at the model as it stands, and again, this is from an outside point of view, the way the UK employs and works with individuals is totally different to the rest of the world, right? I mean, you take France for an example, Switzerland, whoever it might be. How does the Flexor business model expand and grow depending on the countries you're operating in?
Yeah. Actually, relatively simply, I think if we'd have stuck with the job platform model, it would have been quite a lot more complicated. But fundamentally, we kind of strip it back to what our aim is, and that's to provide transparency in the global hiring market. And that means that a French company, what do they offer? An American company, what do they offer in terms of flexibility? Like, it's relatively easy to blueprint on. We've already organically grown into, I think it's about 70 countries from a D2C perspective, and we've got companies headquartered in 12 different countries already. Wow. So clearly the model works for them, and they enjoy using Flexor, even though our user base at the moment is predominantly UK and Europe, because that's where we spend money on paid marketing, but we're expanding into Europe and the US later this year with paid marketing. We have quite an organic presence already. So I think it's just about that idea of transparency, not overcomplicating it. Like, fundamentally, it amazes me that nobody had the idea for Flexor before us. It's a simple product, but sometimes simple products are the best. They solve the most crucial need.
Yeah, I think it translates across borders better than I thought it would. Like, we have these random organic pockets like Portugal, where you've like tons of users, tons of links. Love Flexa. Porto, Lisbon, tons of people message us all the time saying it's great, etc., etc. A few big companies in the Porto area who are on Flexa as well. Yeah. It translates surprisingly well, even to countries where English isn't necessarily the first spoken language as well.
Yeah, and we've organically acquired about 2,500 US users a week, and they're regularly on Flexor, and that keeps growing
with no marketing
spend at all.
Yeah. See, that is good growth, especially with no marketing spend and doing it completely organically. But did you guys wake up one day and go, right, actually we're going to do international rather than the UK, or was it something that just organically and naturally happened?
Organic.
It's organic. It's interesting. I think it's probably a network effect thing through organic social, particularly LinkedIn, and to probably a lesser extent some of the other social platforms. A lot of our interest on the B2B side comes from companies who see their kind of like employer rivals getting flexified, as we call it, and coming onto the platform, and then they'll get in contact with us and say, we'd really like to do that too. So that has like kind of a natural flywheel kind of effect, and that spread us out across different internationals.
It's a nice pre-validation as well, because if we've managed to move into those geographies organically, then we can be pretty confident that when we start spending money, it will resonate, and we'll be able to acquire users and companies in those geographies.
Well, I was going to say, I bet your investors love the fact that you're scaling organically, because it's costing essentially nothing. And looking at the next sort of 24, 36 months as a brand and as a business, then, are you guys going to be pumping the new fund behind the international expansion? What's the sort of plan for Flexor in the long term?
Start and I'll join in. Go on.
I can only really speak to 2022 because I don't like the forecast where it's like we're going to have 50 million in revenue and 17,100,000 users by the end of 2025 when you've got no idea what's going to happen.
What we'll do then, Molly, is we'll
but I'll
stop the
speak about
podcast. We'll stop the podcast right there, and that will be your prediction, and that's how it will end.
Yeah,
It's not even a number. Molly.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. But speaking to the end of 2022, which is where we're pretty confident we can get to based on sort of everything that we've done so far, is we're hoping to get to 2 million users on the platform globally, focusing on UK, Europe, the US, Australia and New Zealand, because they have very similar flexible working penetrations to the UK and Ireland, where we have a really strong base, and having about 800 flexified companies on the platform as well.
Wow.
That's the aim.
And Maurice, does that add up with what you were going to say, or is that news to you?
It's like I'm redoing my financial model on the side. It's just like 800, is it? No, that's it very right to me. We'll start to move more and more outside of the UK to kind of come back to your initial question. And as Molly said earlier, like most of our spend, pretty all our spend is UK and Ireland focused at the moment. As we start to raise more money and spend more money, we'll start to focus more on other jurisdictions. But yeah, hopefully we'll have about 800 companies on the platform at the end of the year. It should be great.
It should be great.
You guys are the most chilled couple I think we've ever had on this podcast. It's just all it's seemingly very easy, but I imagine you're like ducks and paddling frantically under the water. Maurice, what does success look like to you? And you can't say anything about money here. What does success look like to you?
I can say anything about money.
No.
God, that's a great question. I think, to remove money from the question, I think having a globally recognized brand in the space that we're in. So I think we want to get to a point over the next few years when people talk about Flex in the same way they talk about Glassdoor, and the man or lady in the street would say, "Oh, I checked that company out in Flexa," in the same way.
But way better than Glassdoor.
But better. We're not allowed to say the same, but better. But that's where we want to get to, really. And I think if we get to that point, that's what X revenue, that's what success would look like to me, where it's just a household name and we're just synonymous with flexibility and good working cultures.
Revenue's a byproduct of success, right, in terms of growth. So Molly, what is yours? Is yours
exactly
not getting fired from your own business, maybe?
Yeah, if Maurice doesn't sack me, that'd be great. I think from a business perspective, I absolutely agree with Maurice. I think from a longer term personal perspective, I think success is freedom. And ideally having the freedom, and I won't talk about money, freedom to have my old dog's home. That's what I want.
As in your old dogs come home rather than the home your old dogs lived in. Is that what you meant by that?
No, like an old dog's home.
You physically want to buy an old dog's home? Oh, this is innovative. Okay, like Dogs Trust, but for older dogs. Okay. Again, another tangent.
No one wants to adopt them, so they get stuck in kennels.
Oh, look at this, Maurice.
Probably a hard one to get funding for externally.
Yeah.
I think incredibly. You're going to have to
It
go to
makes me
charity.
really sad.
I know.
It would be a charity, exactly.
Yeah, exactly. There you go. Maurice, you've not married a mad cat lady. You're going to marry a crazy dog lady. But, there's something in it.
Yeah.
It's a crazy dog woman instead.
Yeah.
Exactly. I'm on a weekly basis, I get reminded about the old dogs. So, yeah, I'm familiar.
Yeah.
No, but go back to Flex. I love Flex. So there's only occasionally that businesses come on this podcast and we jump off the podcast and go, right, we need to go and sign up and have a look at this website. This is one of them. I'm going to get the guys to jump onto Flex and be as brutally honest as possible about us, and hopefully that'll help with our recruitment campaigns. But if other businesses and employees and teams want to do the same, where do they go, guys?
So if you're a company that's interested in finding out for free how flexible you are, so it's all free. The first stage will be kind of insights and tips, and takes 3 minutes to do a little quiz. Then just go on flexor.careers and you'll see Get Flexified in the top. And that will take you straight to be able to do the quiz. And if you are somebody who's looking for a genuinely flexible company and you're thinking about moving, as more than half of the workforce is currently, then go on Flexor as well and click Browse Companies.
Perfect, guys. I've loved every minute. I'm going to go and do exactly that. Thank you so much for joining me.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.